All right. You're here. This is a great group on a Sunday afternoon, hopefully on the heels of COVID, but thank you all for coming out. I always say it's nice to be invited, but it's actually even nicer when people show up and want to listen. So you're a huge part of why this is happening. It's not just me being here, it's you being here, and I hope that what we cover today will be useful for you, not only in your own personal life, in your family, but also in your relationships with those that God brings across your path. So I wanted to say a couple things before we begin. First of all, this is the book on worry, but I wanted to let you know I don't even know if it's available on Amazon yet. I think beginning of March, but I have copies here today, and it's a new revised version, and it incorporates some of the information that I'm going to be covering in the first part of this session, which is kind of neuroscience, brain science, and body, those components of anxiety. That was not in my original book, and I just, as I've counseled, as I've grown, have come to see how significant and important that is. So the publisher was kind enough to allow me to do some provide some additional information and update the book. So this is the newest copy, and they're available at the book table in the back, where my lovely wife Barbara will serve you. I'm thankful that she's able to be here with me. Also, this is my latest book, Unstuck, and some of you have gotten it, but some of you may not know that if you go to my website, timlane.org, just click any of the tabs, and it will take you to a page where it will say resources, and it will say Tim's Publications, and then free study guide for Unstuck. There's a free, about 70-page study guide, a writable PDF that you can download and use this not only personally, but if you're discipling someone. This book really is a very accessible, simple introduction to how to grow in grace. But I've also provided enough complexity so that it accounts for sometimes people and their more complex chronic struggles as well. So just wanted to let you know about this book, timlane.org, and you can see on that top tab under resources, free study guide. So just a little information. All right, how many of you were here this morning in the service? Okay, most of you. So I preached on Matthew 6 and the section where Jesus talks about worry, and basically said three things. Worry can be a good emotion. Worry also can be a debilitating emotion. And then talked about how Jesus is helping us replace peace with anxiety. Obviously, that's a process. So what I'm going to do this afternoon is start with really more of the physiological, bodily brain component to anxiety. Talk a little bit about it in terms of modern research, what we can learn from modern research. And then in the second session, we'll get more in the direction of, how did Scripture begin to address it? How do we bring those together to finally help people, not only ourselves, but those that God has called us to serve and help. So, as you're thinking about what we're covering today, I want to put this in a context. So, imagine yourself on a Sunday morning like this. You've finished worship, or maybe during the week you're finishing up a Bible study, and someone begins to tell you about their struggle with anxiety, and you start to wonder what you need to do, and you start to then struggle with anxiety. Okay? I don't know what to do. I'm fearful. I'm anxious. I'm worried. But I want you to put yourself in that kind of context. Now, everything that I'm sharing with you is not something that you would share with them, but what it will do, hopefully, is it will reduce your anxiety so that you can be a safe person for the person struggling with anxiety. In fact, that is, to put it bluntly, the most important thing that someone who struggles with anxiety needs. They need safety. And you could be that first experience of safety for them if you're coming in equipped and informed, okay? Let's consider anxiety, what it is, and how to change. So the first thing here is just defining anxiety. And these are some technical definitions. So here it is. Anxiety is defined as a state of intense apprehension, uncertainty, and fear resulting from the anticipation of a threatening event or situation, often to a degree that normal physical and psychological functioning is disrupted. So there's a difference between concern and living in that zone, but then stepping into a new experience where your thinking and your body begins to dysregulate, and it creates problems, not only for you personally, but also interpersonally. The American Psychiatric Association purports that each of the anxiety disorders shares features of fear and anxiety. Fear is the emotional response to real or perceived threat, whereas anxiety is anticipation of future threat. So fear typically has an object, a fear of snakes, a fear of dogs, for whatever reason. Maybe you were bitten by a dog as a young child, but it also is sometimes an irrational fear of the future, and that's where you begin to move into things like catastrophizing. The physiological symptoms of anxiety include muscle tension, heart palpitations, sweating, dizziness, or shortness of breath. So it's a very physiological experience, and people talk about panic attacks. That's why. Anxiety is ramping up all of your major organs, and you're going into survival mode. And that's great if a grizzly bear is chasing you. It may not be so great if you're about to have to stand up and speak to a crowd of people, right? But it is a very physiological experience. When we are experiencing anxiety for prolonged periods of time, that will lead to cardiovascular problems. Here's an interesting statistic. So, couples who are in a good marriage typically live about 10 years longer than couples in bad marriages. Why? Because the stress of the bad marriage tears your body down. Interesting, isn't it? So that state of being under stress, anxiety, it takes a toll on your body. Oftentimes there's a connection between anxiety and depression, as I'll mention in just a moment. But there are emotional symptoms also: restlessness, a sense of impending doom. I'm going to have a hard time chewing gum and walking at the same time here. Emotional symptoms include restlessness, a sense of impending doom, fear of dying, fear of embarrassment or humiliation, or fear of something terrible happening. So there's just that painful experience of fear. This is interesting. Listen, anxiety is often exhibited through disturbances in cardiovascular, gastrointestinal, and or musculoskeletal systems. So you see the physiological impact. Anxiety derives from the Indo-Germanic root ang, which means narrowing, constricting, and tightening feelings, usually in the chest or throat. In such cases, people might not be conspicuously aware of the anxiousness, although it is being expressed through stomach aches, heart palpitations, difficulty in breathing, and the like. So can any of you identify with that experience? How many of you can identify with experiencing that at one point or another? Yeah. For all kinds of reasons, right? So, by the way, that is your body saying, get to a safe place. Get to a safe place. It's not safe here. And that is a good instinct. It's a good instinct. If we didn't have that, we wouldn't be alive. All right. The challenge is when you're running at that level all the time. That's what creates problems. What's the prevalence? So each year, anxiety disorders impact approximately 18% or 40 million adults in the United States. How many people are in the United States now? Is it close to 300 million? somewhere in there. So think about that. That's a lot of people. And when they talk about anxiety disorders, they're talking about the ones that begin to impact your ability to function individually, and they're starting to impact your relationships interpersonally. So how many of you ever heard of the word psychopathology? Okay. Psychopathology means a problem in your thinking. And basically what that word means is you're struggling to such a degree that you are not functioning well as an individual, and your interpersonal relationships are being impacted negatively as well. That's a psychopathology. All right, just to kind of bring the language down to where most of us live. Listen to this. Close to 50% of individuals diagnosed with an anxiety disorder also meet the criteria for a depressive disorder. So 50% of people who struggle with anxiety also will struggle with some degree of depression. Not always, but that's a pretty significant percentage. And oftentimes the reason that's the case is anxiety is such a physiological experience that when you're anxious for a while, what happens after you come through that bout of anxiety is you dip into a depression or a state of sadness because your body's worn down. And so being able to diagnose correctly, I've had clients that I'm counseling, and they come in and they say, I think I'm struggling with anxiety. And I start to talk with them, and they talk about how they're shrinking their world and they're not going places. And then I begin to say, well, maybe this is not anxiety, maybe it's depression. Or do you find yourself going back and forth? And so being able to correctly kind of get a sense of the person's experience is really helpful. And the way you do that as a safe person is you just say, tell me about your experience. Tell me about what happens when you're anxious. When does that happen? Are there certain specific things that trigger it? Are there things that happen during a particular time of year that might trigger your anxiety? Tell me a little bit more about whether you experience any sadness or depression. So you're asking questions and you're being curious. That's one of the most wonderful gifts you can give to somebody is your curiosity. I'm interested in knowing what your experience is. I'm here to listen, to ask helpful and hopefully encouraging questions. Let me break down this prevalence, though. So 40 million people, that's 1 in 5. 45% of those 40 million people, so almost half, will exist in what they call a mild state of anxiety. They struggle with it at a mild level. 33% of that 40 million are moderate. And then 22% are what they will call severe. And that's when someone is really having a hard time functioning, may even begin to narrow their world down where they don't even leave their house. The various anxiety disorders, I'm just putting this in there for you to be aware. So in the modern research, they're studying people, and they're usually really good at studying what the experience is. And they're able to give those particular types of anxiety-based struggles or disorders particular names. And I just listed them there for you. If you wanted to get more information on those, I would encourage you to go to the National Institute of Mental Health. It's www.nimh.nih.gov. And I can give you that later if you want. That's a great resource if you're wanting something trustworthy that is just looking at these struggles, these disorders, and they're describing them for you. They're not telling you what will help these people. Sometimes there's some information in there about this is what typically will help people, but it's very limited in its nature. But you will get a rich description of each of these types of things that are that are driven by anxiety. So that's just for your benefit. Hopefully you will think that that's the case. Okay, so that's a general introduction to a definition, what's the prevalence, what's going on physiologically, psychologically. So how are we to think about anxiety? How are we to take a holistic view of people and understand the experience of anxiety? And I think it's really important whenever you're thinking about a struggle to view it through the lens of the way God has made us, right? God has made us both body and soul. We're embodied souls. And we want to make sure that we're taking both of those seriously. Now, my training is largely in theology and Bible. Prior to that, I was an English major and a philosophy major. So, understanding the physiological body-brain component is basically where I spend most of my time now growing and developing professionally. I actually, and you can consider doing this, I do a lot of online courses, and I get them through a platform called Pesi.com, capital PESI.com. It's basically some of the richest, best research out there. Now, it's not coming from a Christian point of view. It's empirical research by people who drill in and study a particular issue. And so I will do online courses. I did an online course on anxiety, and it was about 12, 15 hours of lecture. Just very, very helpful for me as the person that was teaching it helped me understand, though I'm coming from a theological, biblical perspective, helping me understand the physiological and the brain component of anxiety, and oftentimes what basic skills can help people. And what that does is it adds to, if you will, my ability to holistically help someone. So I bring both a theological but also a more informed bodily brain kind of understanding of the person. And so I'm looking at this, and I'm looking at all issues through the lens of body and soul. Okay, anxiety and your body and brain. So understanding this, and this will be an interesting connection to Matthew 6 and the way Jesus addresses anxiety in that passage. Understanding this helps you connect Scripture and the gospel to this person that you're helping, along with giving them some practical coping skills. So understanding how the brain and the body work can oftentimes take the mystery out of it for you. So this struggle isn't so spooky and scary. It actually begins to normalize it when you understand what's happening in the body and brain. The other thing that it does, so sometimes I have someone in my office and they're struggling with anxiety, and I'll just say, well, are you aware of how anxiety works in the brain and the body? And they'll say, no, I haven't a clue. I said, well, let me talk to you about that. And here's what's going on. And oftentimes they'll look at me and say, oh, that's really, really helpful. One, it means that my body is functioning properly. I need to deal with this, but it also helps me to realize, I'm not a strange kind of freak of nature. And it helps just normalize the person's view of themselves and their struggle, because oftentimes people bring a lot of guilt and shame into the friendship relationship, if you're a friend, but especially when they come to counseling, if the stigma of counseling has been taken away, that's one thing. But when they step into the counseling office, when they're meeting with me, oftentimes I can take away that guilt and shame just by normalizing their struggle. I think I mentioned this morning in my sermon, just getting to know someone's story. This is always true for me. Someone comes in with a struggle. They're sharing with me their struggle. I'm asking them, tell me about the symptoms. When does it happen? They're going into a lot of detail. Now tell me your story. And when they tell me their story, I look at them and I say, gosh, it makes a lot of sense why you're struggling with this. In fact, I've been through some similar things, or if I had been through what you had been through, I would probably be struggling with the same thing. And that can be deeply encouraging to someone. Okay, so very important for us to think about this. So the first thing I want us to consider is your autonomic nervous system. There is more information on this chart than you need to be aware of, and the slide that you have, I'm sure, is not decipherable because it's way too small. But what I want you to see is this. So our autonomic nervous systems ideally should be running over here in the second column from the left and the third column from the left. And if you'll notice, that's the difference between calm and alert. And what we want in our autonomic nervous systems is that ability to slide between those two states with some degree of adroitness. All right? On the far end is lethargy. That's where you move in the direction of depression. Someone isn't able to move into calm and alert. On the far right is the fight or flight or freeze response when you're in danger. So, flight, fight, there's hyperfreeze and hypofreeze. And hypofreeze is when you shut down. It's almost when you play possum. And that is a survival skill. So if you were in extreme danger, and let's say somebody was looking for you, you would freeze and you would play dead, literally. I've watched people do that. They're in a meeting and they're being criticized, and rather than go into fight or flight mode and get defensive and fight back or try to get out of the room, these people will just shut down. All right. That's a great thing to do, again, if you're being chased by a grizzly bear. Fight, flight, or freeze, right? I'm going to do everything I can to get up that tree away from this bear. And your body is pumping cortisol and adrenaline into your system, and it's doing everything that it knows to do to keep you alive, because that's what your brain and body are supposed to do. And you want that when you're in danger. The problem is when you're living in that state and there isn't any real danger. It's perceived on your part, but you're not in any true danger. It would be like having your car at a stop sign and you've got the accelerator on and it's running at really many RPMs, more than it needs to. And what happens if you sit there at a stop sign and you run a car at high RPMs when you don't need to? What happens to the car? It starts to break the different parts of the car down. It can only do that for so long. And so that's what's happening. But the ideal and where we want to live is in that calm and alert. So let me give you an example. This morning I got up, my alarm went off at 6:45, and I was in the lethargic zone. Oh, gosh. I don't know if I want to get up. Am I going to make it today? I got a lot of work to do. I got a lot of talking to do, and I hope I can be remotely interesting so people will listen to me. But there was a lot of lethargy. But then as I got up and, got some coffee, got a shower, started to get dressed, I moved into calm. And then as I drove here, I was starting to become more alert. My wife was thankful that I was alert while I was driving. And right now, I'm in that alert active mode. That's where my autonomic nervous system is right now. And then after this, I will go back into calm and then rest. And that's really where we want to live. Now, if I'm driving back to our house or hotel and there's a traffic accident or there's something dangerous, then I want to move over to that potentially fight or flight zone where I'm hypervigilant and I'm very, very perceptive about what's going on in front of me. I almost get tunnel vision. That's what happens when you're in a fight or flight mode. You get tunnel vision because you don't need peripheral vision. I just need to see what's ahead of me that's coming after me, that's attacking me. or that might cause my life to be in danger. That would be an appropriate response. But in general, we're wanting to live in that calm and active and alert zone, and we're moving back and forth. So the reason I share that diagram is it helps you kind of see how we're moving along that continuum throughout any given day. And you can see how if there has been maybe trauma, difficult experiences, maybe hardwiring that sets you up more for that fight or flight response, you can see why it's hard to come out of that. And what you're doing in your friendships and in your counseling and in the coping skills, and as you bring God's grace to bear on a person's life, is you're teaching them to move out of that fight or flight space and move back into alert and calm. It would be just the opposite if you're dealing with someone who's depressive. Helping someone become calm and then move into alert is what you're trying to do. Okay? Any quick questions about that information so far? Okay? Because they don't know how to regulate. They have a hard time regulating. By the way, if you're not familiar with attachment theory, you need to be. Look up attachment theory. What it is it's research that basically talks about how significantly impactful a person's primary caregivers are in those early years of child development. From the moment a child is born, probably even before so. The brain and autonomic nervous system tone of the primary caregivers is going to shape the autonomic nervous system of the child. So if you have a parent or both parents that are living in the fight or flight mode and you grow up around that, guess what? That child is going to develop that state. It's establishing the tone of the autonomic nervous system. And all the more reason why we need to be mindful as we think about parenting young children. They're very, very sensitive and malleable. The nice thing is you can grow. But that's something to keep in mind. Let me mention something else about the nervous system and neurochemicals. So these are chemicals that are already in your system. We have oxytocin, serotonin, dopamine, estrogen, testosterone. But the two neurochemicals or hormones that are active in anxiety and fight or flight are adrenaline and cortisol. So when you sense that you're in danger, your heart rate goes above 100. Unless you're an athlete, then above 80. Above 100, you start to breathe shallowly. And what your heart is doing is it's pumping blood to your extremities and all of your major organs. It's not getting blood and oxygen to this part of your brain. This is where you make your rational decisions. This is the most developed part of the brain. It's called the prefrontal cortex. And if you don't get blood and oxygen here, it goes offline. Why? Because you don't need your prefrontal cortex when a grizzly bear is chasing after you. You don't need to say, well, I wonder what the poundage of that bear is. I wonder what the pressure of the jaw will be on my neck when it finally catches me. You don't need to know the species, and you don't need to know all these details. You don't need your prefrontal cortex. You need the survival part of your brain, the limbic region of your brain, your amygdala. It's kicking in, and it's doing its job. But also, adrenaline and cortisol are being secreted into your body, and those neurochemicals are there to help you survive as well, to give you the strength, sometimes the supernatural strength you need. Have you ever heard these stories of somebody sees a car accident and they're able to lift a car off of somebody? That's exactly what's going on. I think there was a story about Herschel Walker. He did that. That's back in the 80s. But no, that's what's going on, and we're thankful for that. Again, the problem is when it's working overtime. All right, let me move into the brain. So that's the autonomic nervous system. That's neurochemicals and hormones. What's going on in the brain? So think about your brain very, very simply in terms of your fist. All right, if you want to make a fist, you have the brain stem, which is back here. That's survival. That's what keeps your heart beating and your lungs breathing when you're asleep at night. But it's just kind of, keeping the motors running. Then you have the mid region of your brain. That's the limbic region of the brain, and that's where emotions are formed. Not the only place. Right brain is where that happens as well, but you have the emotional brain, and you have what is called, we'll look at it in a moment, your amygdala. And then you have your neocortex, which is the higher ordered thinking. How many of you know how old you are when this part of your brain fully develops? Somebody said 24, 25? Right. So I have a 24-year-old, and I'm still saying his prefrontal cortex has still not fully developed. Lord, have mercy on me and him. Okay. By the way, anybody that's a youth pastor or you have teenagers, you need to be aware of that. That limbic region is what is very active in the life of a teenager. They're venturing out. They're making new friends. They're taking risky. They're making risky decisions, and you want to be able to parent them through that. But just think of your brain in that way. Those three. And then, to get a little bit more technical, this picture is showing another aspect of the brain called the amygdala. So your amygdala, that's Latin for almond, because your amygdala are shaped like almonds, and you have one on either side of your brain, the right and left side. Think of that as the smoke detector in your brain. That is what is scanning your environment in a very, very quick and sometimes very imprecise way, and determining whether or not it's safe or not. The amygdala ultimately is the source of anxiety. So when you think about anxiety, think about the amygdala, and whatever agitates the amygdala creates anxiety. So the source of all anxiety is connected physiologically to that part of your brain, which is designed to keep you safe, and it's designed to keep you scanning your environment for danger. So anything that agitates the amygdala is going to create anxiety or a sense of lack of safety and a need to protect oneself. Again, wonderful part of the brain. But it's also primitive and very imprecise. So let's talk about anxiety in the brain. The amygdala is the gatekeeper. And the other thing I failed to mention is the prefrontal cortex, the right and left cortex. So the left cortex is more logical and linear. The right cortex of your brain is more emotions, more imagination, and they play a role in anxiety as well, but it's only as they agitate the amygdala. Let's talk about just what's going on in the brain very quickly. So talk about what's happening with the amygdala. So the amygdala develops a sense of fight or flight or freeze, a sense of danger by association. So you have a trigger, you have a negative association, and that negative event leads to an emotional reaction. It's almost automatic. So let me give you an example. So let's say I'm walking down a path and I see out of the corner of my eye something that looks like a snake. Now, my amygdala has a negative association with snakes. All right, I've never been fond of snakes. I don't like holding them. I don't like seeing them. I saw one this past summer, a huge rat snake going through our backyard. I was up on a deck 100 yards away, and I'm starting to get jittery. Why? Because my amygdala has a negative association with snakes. But if I'm walking down a path, I may see something out of my periphery that looks like a snake. My amygdala has a negative association. Snakes are dangerous, and I will jump out of the way right away. Have you ever experienced that where, something that looks like it could be dangerous, you immediately react, and then you look back and you think, oh, it was only a stick, right? And what happens is you're able to think as you look at it, but the amygdala is like that. And it is an instantaneous, primitive way of sensing out danger. And so anytime your amygdala has a negative association with something, then it's going to agitate the amygdala and it's going to put you in a state of anxiety. So let me give you a couple of examples. So what are triggers? All kinds of things could be triggers. Let's say someone was sexually assaulted by someone with red hair. You will have a negative association with people with red hair. Let's get more practical in the church. When I was a pastor, I had a woman who had a real negative experience with church leaders in a previous church she had been in. I didn't know this at the time. We were concerned about some things in her life, so guess what I did? Young 35-year-old pastor that I was, I said, why don't you come and meet with me and 2 other men so that we can talk to you? Guess what happened? She was triggered. She came to the office and she sat there, but she actually went into a freeze mode. Looking back on it now, 30 some odd years later, she went into freeze mode to survive. Other people would go into fight or flight mode. I've had that happen unintentionally in my office. I was there with a husband and wife. The wife had experienced significant physical abuse by her father growing up. At one point, me and her husband are pressing her gently for an answer. She starts to be triggered by that experience. It's not even close to what she experienced with her dad, but that sense of men and men being unsafe, and now she's being asked by her husband and me. She was actually in the corner of my office. The door is here. She gets triggered and has to get up and walk. And I say, you please step out of the office. Let's take a break. I immediately realize, she was just triggered. And that is that negative association. It can be a sight, it can be a sound, it can be a smell, it can be touch. All kinds of things can function as triggers. So that's how anxiety works as it relates to the amygdala. And we'll talk a little bit about how you help people with those types of experiences. Now let's talk about the right and left brain. This is just really helpful to know. Me understanding this has helped me tremendously as I'm working with people. So the cortex agitates the amygdala via interpretation, not association. Okay? So the cortex interprets. And remember that the cortex up here and the prefrontal cortex are the most developed and sophisticated parts of our brains. They're the parts of our brains that put a man on the moon. That's how powerful they are. And that's how influential they can be when it comes to anxiety. So what happens with the left brain is there is an interpretation, a negative interpretation. With the right brain, there may be an image. So the left brain, there may be pessimism, obsessing, perfectionism, catastrophizing, ruminating, guilt and shame. With the right brain, it's more imagination and imagery. What do you see up here? I don't know if you can see that. Do you see that box at the top? Pac-Man, okay. What do you see up there? A what? A triangle? All right, do you see what your cortex just did? It added information. There aren't lines drawing a triangle. There are 3 circles with a little pie-shaped area cut out. So your cortex can add information. It can overinterpret. It can misinterpret. And when that happens, right, if I get up and speak in front of this group, I'm going to say something stupid, I'm going to embarrass myself, and it's going to be a complete catastrophe. That is my cortex adding information, right? Is that possible? Yes. Is it likely? Well, in the 40 years I've been doing this, I've had a few people laugh at me and walk out, but in general, no. But my cortex adds information. And that's not only what we call cognitive distortions, but also imagery. I could actually begin to imagine some of you in this audience before I got up here, maybe, whispering to one another saying, this guy's an idiot. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Or, I see a couple of people laughing. I'm like, are they laughing at me? See, that's an image. And guess what? Maybe that's connected to being made fun of in my past. Who knows? But that's what's going on when it comes to anxiety. So the amygdala is the source. It has a negative association with something. The cortex is interpreting things, and it oftentimes adds information that creates what they call cognitive distortions. Let me give you an illustration about this before we just take some Q&A here. About 2 years ago, my daughter moved to Pennsylvania, and she was living for a while with my other daughter and her husband and our 2 grandsons. At some point, she decided that she thought it would be best, and everyone did, that she get her own apartment. So we're in Georgia. We're hearing about all this, all fine and well. We find out that she's found an apartment. She moves into the apartment, and we later went up to help her while we were visiting to move some more things in as we visited our other daughter, her husband, and our grandsons. One evening, my wife and I helped her go buy some things at Target, and we drove to her apartment complex for the first time. So we drive in, and it's dark, but, in the parking lot, it's fairly well lit. And as we get out of the car, I'm initially thinking, this is a single female living alone, so there are certain concerns that I ought to have, but I started dealing with cognitive distortions, and catastrophizing. And that's not completely unwarranted, right? That began to agitate my amygdala. I walk to the front, and I'm thinking, we're going into her apartment, and it's one of these doors that's out in the well-lit parking lot. She goes up the steps and takes a left, goes around the end of the building, takes a right, and as we're going around the building, it's kind of dark in this corner, and she takes another right on the back side of the building, and that's where her door is. And I have this image of an area that's not well lit. And not only that, there's this huge piece of shrubbery right here at the corner where she's going to walk around every single night. All of a sudden, I have an image, right brain, agitating my amygdala. I get on the phone the next day with the apartment complex. Do you have any other, apartment in your complex that's not on the back side of a building? And I'm saying crazy things like, I'm a man and I'm scared going back there. Can you guys, rework your lighting? I'm anxious. And there are good reasons for me to be, right? We don't live in a safe world. And people are taken advantage of. And young women are taken advantage of. So there's some degree of concern that I should have. We go back home. I'm able to leave. I cannot get that image of the corner of that building out of my mind, and I can't get those cognitive distortions out of my mind because at some level they're rooted in reality. For 1 or 2 months, I'd go to bed. Before I would go to bed, though, I would text her. Where are you? She's 22, 23 at the time. Where are you? Oh, I'm leaving work. Okay, it gets darker in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, much sooner than it does here. Okay, well, tell me when you get to the parking lot. And when you get to the parking lot, why don't you call me? And while you're walking to your apartment door, why don't you just talk to me? It took me about 2 or 3 months. Oh, the other thing that happened, okay, she would do that. Then I would go to bed at night, and guess what? My imagination would start kicking in. And I would wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning. And it was probably 2 or 3 months that I was doing that. So that is a perfect example, very simple example of how right brain, left brain agitating my amygdala was creating anxiety in me as a father. Okay? All right. We want to talk about anxiety and the soul, and we're going to do that in just a moment. But I want to kind of pause right now and just get some feedback from you. Any questions or comments? Is this new information? Raise your hand if it's new. Okay, so for most of you, is it helpful? Okay. What happens as you're listening to this when you think about your own anxieties? What's the impact on you as you're thinking about your own struggles with anxiety? It was for me, it was just a matter of time. Yeah. There are specific things that I probably did, but at some level, the anxiety never went completely away. But it did subside. I didn't find myself waking up in the middle of the night as much. But over time, as she was able to get to her apartment, and then I knew, okay, it's summer's coming, and it's going to be lighter out longer, so it's not going to be dark when she goes home. She was starting to make sure she was connecting with friends as she was getting home. Do you have people in the apartment that you've gotten to know that are there, that are safe, that are looking out for you? Just a lot of those things started to come online. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. I'm probably not the best expert on that. There are other parts of the brain that they associate with ADHD, the basal ganglia. And that's about all I know right now. Yeah. So what they're finding now, brain science and research is like the past 15, 20 years has just come light years, and we're probably still in the Neanderthal age. You could see those regions of the brain, particularly amygdala, those things would light up with activity if you were to put somebody under a video MRI. Yeah, those regions would be more activated. So what's interesting is they've done experiments in marriage therapy, and if someone is experiencing that and a stranger comes in and holds their hand, it's not noticeable that those regions of the brain calm down. But when a spouse who's been in counseling and the other spouse who's having the video done of their brain, if they have a safe connection with their spouse, that area of the brain calms down. So there's something profound that we'll talk about safe human community.
So you mentioned triggers.
Yes.
How do you sort of handle those triggers? How do you maybe reduce the reaction to those triggers, things like that?
Yeah, so we'll get a little bit into that when we talk about things to do to help. But like with the amygdala, let's say, you can think about flying an airplane, but let's just stick with snakes. I do not want to touch a snake right now. But I can, and it is possible to rewire your brain. So I haven't talked about neuroplasticity and what they're learning about the brain and how malleable it is. It's not set in stone at 25. It continues to grow and develop. There's this individual by the name of Dan Siegel. He says, where awareness goes, neural firing flows and neural wiring grows. So you can rewire your brain. And that's exactly what, safe human community and good counseling can help with. But with the amygdala and the negative association with snakes, the way that you would go about alleviating that anxiety is through what they call exposure therapy. And it sounds real harsh, but if it's done compassionately. So if I wanted to grow in my comfort level with snakes, I would just start studying them. I would find out, which ones are poisonous, non-poisonous. I would learn, how to handle snakes. That would be the first step. Then I might take another incremental step. I'd go to the zoo and I might look at them at the zoo, and study them. And then eventually you slowly, incrementally expose the amygdala to that experience so that it's no longer a negative experience. So think about, have you guys seen the pictures of these men in the early 1900s, and they're building all these huge buildings in the major cities in our country, and they're hanging out on these huge steel beams, and you're like, what in the world are they doing? They're sitting out there, they're 50 floors above the street, and they're just out there without any kind, and this was before safety was thought of, right, in these situations. How did that happen? It was through exposure. I'm working on the ground floor this week. And next 6 months, I'll be on the second floor. And then the next thing, I'm on the third floor, then the fifth floor. And I'm getting higher and higher and higher. And my amygdala is being rewired and desensitized to being agitated by the fear of heights slowly over time via exposure. So I know there are a lot of questions I'm not answering when it comes to trauma and abuse, things like that. So, I just want to be sensitive to that. But you could see how abuse can impact the brain. Negative associations and also cognitive distortions, right and left brain. Trauma. I have a gentleman who was an Afghan vet, and he had to do things that he would rather not speak of when he was in the army in Afghanistan. And if he were to come into this room right now, what do you think he'd be looking for? The exits. See that red exit sign? That would be the first thing he would see. If you've ever been in a situation, I counseled a couple, the wife was actually in a church shooting in Texas when she was growing up. So when she walks into a church, guess what she's doing? She's looking for the exit sign. She's thinking about, how am I going to get out of here? My wife, who works in a manufacturing plant, they just had a couple of years ago active shooter training. What do you do in the event of an active shooter? They even talk to them about how whenever you park in a parking lot, you should back in. Because if someone's coming after you, you can run them over to protect yourself. Okay. Yes?
I was just wondering if you could comment on the rise of anxiety related to social media.
Oh my, that's a whole nother subject. The rise of anxiety through social media. We're going to talk about certain things. That's one of them. So yes, particularly with young people, social media is basically, let me present to you my most fake self and convince you that my life is great when it's really not. and then everybody else will feel terrible because their life isn't that great. And we'll just kind of try to one-up one another. And let's do that incessantly, day after day, hour after hour. Not only that, let's build a synthetic relationship, not real connected relationship. So a lot of things with social media, 24-hour news cycle. All of those things are, it's interesting too, the research shows that the more safe a society becomes, so with basic things like food and shelter, our anxiety doesn't decrease, it increases. You would think just the opposite would be the case. So what that tells me is it's not always just situational things that will alleviate anxiety. Okay, when you think about people that you're aware of, maybe it's a family member, a friend, someone that you're close to at work or in the church, what does this do for you as you think about them? Does it increase your compassion or decrease it? Please say increase. Please, Lord Jesus, help me. Yeah, it should increase your compassion. And just through understanding what's going on. There is a reason this person is anxious. And again, we'll get to that in just a moment. Okay, how are we doing? We're at the hour. So what we're going to do is we're going to break. And there is an opportunity to buy books if you like, but just let's take a 5-minute break, 5 to 10 minute break. We'll come back and we'll start our second session where we'll look at more kind of how Scripture comes at this issue, and then what are some practical things that we can do personally but interpersonally as we help people. All right.